And we're back. Welcome, guys, to Another World Audiobooks. Thank you for tuning in. If you haven't checked it out, I would highly suggest going to the website. First of all, you can request a full free audiobook. We've done tons of books over the years on the podcast, and if you want to hear any of them full, unabridged, no interruptions, no ads, no intro and outro, all that sort of thing, you can get that book for free. And a lot of fans of the podcast have done that. So if you haven't, you owe it to yourself. Might as well grab one of those books for free, and I'd be happy to send it to you as a thank you for listening. And also on the website, we do have the merchandise. If you click on the merchandise tab, or merch, I think, it'll take you right over to our Another World Audiobooks store. We've got some hand-drawn illustrations that grace the front of t-shirts and hoodies and hats and all sorts of stuff. So it's really cool stuff that I have created myself, and I think you'll really dig it. So there are the logo, Another World Audiobooks logo, as well as some other stuff as well. So go and check that out. Again, that's anotherworldaudiobooks.com, and just click on the merch tab. I think you'll find something you like, and it would go a long way toward supporting the show as well if people check that out. And then it gives you a conversation piece too. You can go like, where'd you get that hoodie? And you're like, well, there's this podcast that I listen to. That would be awesome. So thanks, guys, for listening and for spreading the word about the podcast through buying merch. And without further ado, let's jump into the next chapter of Meet the Tiger. Chapter 4. A Social Evening. No, said the Saint, shaking his head sadly. It can't be done. It can't, really. For one thing, we're getting all melodramatic, and I know how you hate that. For another thing, we've got the set all wrong. You've got to get into training for looking evil. Just now, you're as harmless-looking a blackguard as I've ever met. I'm strong for getting the atmosphere right. What do you say to adjourning, and we can arrange to meet in Limehouse in about 2 months? Which will give you time to grow a beard, and develop a cast in one eye, and employ a few tame thugs by way of local colour. The Saint rambled on in his free and easy manner, while his brain dealt rapidly with the situation. Bittle had not raised his automatic. It pointed innocuously into the carpet, held as loosely as it could be without falling, for Simon's eyes were narrowed down to glinting chips of steel that missed nothing, and Sir John Bittle had an uncomfortable feeling that those eyes were keen enough to note the slightest tightening of a muscle. The Saint was giving an admirable imitation of a man pretending to be off his guard. But the millionaire knew that the sight of the least threatening movement would telegraph an instant message to the hand that played with that slim little knife. And the Saint's general manner suggested that he felt calmly confident of being able to reproduce any and every stunt in any and every Mexican knife-throwing act that ever was, with a few variations and trimmings of his own. "You are not conversational, Bittle," said the Saint, and Bittle smiled. "My style is, to say the least, cramped," replied the millionaire. "If I move, what are the chances of my being pricked with your pretty toy?" "Depends how you move," answered the Saint. "If, for instance, you relax the right hand, so as to allow the ugly toy now reposing there to descend upon the carpet, with what is known to journalists as a sickening thud, then I might say that the chances are about 1,000 to 1 against." Bittle opened his hand, and the gun dropped. He stepped to one side, and the Saint, with a swift, sweeping glide, picked up the weapon and dropped it into his pocket. At the same time, he replaced his own weapon in its concealed sheath. "Now we can be matey again," remarked Simon with satisfaction. "What's the next move? Taking things in a broad way, I can't credit your bunch with much brilliance so far. Dear old Spittle, why on earth must you make such an appalling bloomer? Don't you know that according to the rules of this game, you ought to remain shrouded in mystery until Chapter 30? Now you've been and gone and spoiled my holiday," complained the Saint bitterly, "and I don't know how I shall be able to forgive you." "You are a very extraordinary man, Mr. Templar." The Saint smiled. "True, O King, but you're quite as strange a specimen as ever went into the Old Bailey. For a retired grocer, your command of the Oxford language is astonishing." Bittle did not answer, and the Saint gazed genially around, and seemed almost surprised to see Patricia standing a little behind him. The girl had not known what to make of most of the conversation, but she had recovered from her immediate fear. There was a large assurance about everything the saint did and said, which inspired her with uncomprehending courage, even as it inspired Biddle with uncomprehending anxiety. "Hope we haven't bored you," murmured Simon solicitously. "Would you like to go home?" She nodded, and Templar looked at the millionaire. "She would like to go home," Templar said in his most winning voice. A thin smile touched Biddle's mouth.
"Just when we're getting matey?"
he queried. "I'm sure Miss Home didn't mean to offend you," protested Simon. He looked at the girl, who stared blankly at him, and turned to Biddle with an air of engaging frankness. "You see, it's only that she's rather tired." Biddle turned over the cigars in a box on a side table near the saint, selected one, amputated the tip, and lighted it with the loving precision of a connoisseur. Then he faced Templar blandly.
"That happens to be just what I can't allow at the moment,"
said Biddle in an apologetic tone.
"You see, we have some business to discuss."
"I guess it'll keep," said the saint gently.
"I don't think so,"
said Biddle. Templar regarded the other thoughtfully for a few seconds. Then, with a shrug, he jerked the millionaire's automatic from his pocket and walked to the French windows. He opened one of them a couple of inches, holding it with his foot, and signed to the girl to follow him. With her beside him, he said, "Then it looks, Biddle, as if you'll spend tomorrow morning burying a number of valuable dogs."
"I don't think so,"
said Biddle. There was a quiet significance in the way he said it that brought the saint round again on the alert.
"Go on,"
mocked Simon watchfully. Biddle stood with his head thrown back and his eyes half closed, as though listening. Then he said,
"You see, Mr. Templar, if you look in the cigar box, you will find that the bottom sinks back a trifle under quite a light pressure. In fact, it acts as a bell push. There are now 3 men in the garden, as well as 4 bloodhounds, and 2 more in the passage outside this room. And the only dog I can imagine myself burying tomorrow morning is an insolent young puppy who's chosen to poke his nose into my business."
"Well, well, well," said the saint, his hands in his pockets. "Well, well, well." Sir John Biddle settled himself comfortably in his armchair, pulled an ashstand to a convenient position, and continued the leisurely smoking of his cigar. The saint, looking at him in a softly speculative fashion, had to admire the man's nerve. The saint smiled, and then Patricia's hand on his arm brought him back with a jerk to the stern realities of the situation. He took the hand in his, pressed it, and turned the saintly smile on her in encouragement. Then he was weighing Biddle's automatic in a steady hand. "Carrying on the little game of let's pretend," suggested Simon. "Let's suppose that I sort of pointed this gun at you, all nervous and upset, and in my agitation I kind of twiddled the wrong knob. I mean, suppose it went off, and you were in the way. Wouldn't it be awkward?" Biddle shook his head.
"Terribly,"
he agreed.
"And yours is a mystery to make 'em already that I'm afraid they'd talk. You know how unkind gossip can be. Why, they'd be quite capable of saying you did it on purpose."
"There's something in that," said Templar mildly, and he put the gun back in his pocket. "Then suppose I took my little knife and began playing about with it, and it flew out of my hand and took off your ear. Or suppose it sliced off the end of your nose. It's rotten to have only half a nose, or only one ear. People stop and stare at you in the street and so forth."
"And think of my servants,"
said Biddle.
"They're all very attached to me, and they might be quite unreasonably vindictive."
"That's an argument," conceded the saint seriously. "And now suppose you suggest a game." Biddle moved to a more comfortable position, and thought carefully before replying. The time ticked over, but the saint was too old a hand to be rattled by any such primitive device, and he leaned nonchalantly against the wall, and waited patiently for Biddle to realize that the cat-and-mouse gag was getting no laughs that journey. At length Biddle said,
"I should be quite satisfied, Mr. Templar, if you would spend a day or 2 with me, and during that time we could decide on some adequate expression of your regret for your behaviour this evening. As for Miss Home, she and I can finish our little chat uninterrupted, and then I will see her home myself."
Murmured the saint, lounging. "Bit of an optimist, aren't you?"
"I won't take no for an answer, Mr. Templar," said Biddle cordially. "In fact, I expect your room is already being prepared."
The saint smiled. "You almost tempt me to accept," he said. "But it cannot be. If Miss Home were not with us, well, I should be very boorish to refuse. But as a matter of fact, I promised Miss Girton to join them in a sandwich and a glass of ale towards midnight, and I can't let them down."
"Miss Home will make your excuses,"
urged Biddle, but the saint shook his head regretfully. "Another time." Biddle moved again in the chair, and went on with his cigar, and it began to dawn upon the saint that, much as he was enjoying the sociable round of parlour sports, the game was becoming a trifle too one-sided. There was also the matter of Patricia, who was rather a handicap. He found that he was still holding her hand, and was reluctant to make any drastic change in the circumstances, but business was business. With a sigh, the saint hitched himself off the wall which he had found such a convenient prop, released the hand with a final squeeze, and began to saunter round the room, humming light-heartedly under his breath, and inspecting the general fixtures and fittings with a politely admiring eye.
"This room is under observation from 2 points,"
Biddle informed him as a tactful precaution. "Pity we haven't got a camera. The scene'd shoot fine for a shocker," was the saint's only criticism. And Simon went on with his tour of the room. He had taken Biddle's warning with the utmost nonchalance, but its reaction on the problem in hand and his own tentative solution were even then being balanced up in his mind. Biddle, meanwhile, smoked away with a large languidness which indicated his complete satisfaction with the entertainment provided and a sublime disregard for the time spent on digesting it, which was all that the saint could have asked. In its way, it was a classical performance. Anyone with any experience of such things, entering the room, would have sensed at once that both men were past masters. Nothing could have been calmer than their appearance, nothing more polished than their dispassionate exchange of back-chat. The saint worked his unhurried way round the room. Now he stopped to examine a Benares bull, now an etching, now a fine old piece of furniture. The patina on a Greek vase held him enthralled for half a minute. Then he was absorbed in the workmanship of a Sheraton whatnot. In fact, an impartial observer would have gathered that the saint had no other interest in life than the study of various antiques, and that he was thoroughly enjoying a free invitation to take his time over a minute scrutiny of his host's treasures. And all the while the saint's eyes, masked now by lazily drooping lids, were taking in all the details of the furnishings to which he did not devote any ostentatious attention, and searching every inch of the walls for the spy-holes of which Biddle had spoken. The millionaire was unperturbed, and the saint once again permitted the shadow of a smile to touch the corners of his mouth as he caught Patricia's troubled eyes. The smile hardly moved a muscle on his face, but it drew an answering tremor of the girl's lips that showed him that her spirits were still keeping their end up. The saint was banking on Biddle's confidence as a bluffer, and he was not disappointed. Biddle knew that, for all the guards with whom he had surrounded himself, his personal safety hung by the slender thread of a simulated carelessness for it. Biddle knew that to show the least anxiety, the faintest flutter of uncertainty, would have been to throw an additional weapon into Templar's already dangerously comprehensive armory, and that was exactly what Biddle dared not do. Therefore, the millionaire affected not to notice the saint's movements, and never changed his position a fraction, or allowed his eyes to betray him by following Simon round the room. Biddle leaned back among the cushions, and gazed abstractedly at a watercolour on the opposite wall. At another time he studied the pattern on the carpet. Then he looked expressionlessly at Patricia. Once he pored over his fingernails, and measured the length of ash from his cigar against his cuff. All the while the saint was behind him, but Biddle did not turn his head, and the saint was filled with hope and misgiving at the same time. He had located one peephole, cunningly concealed below a pair of old horse pistols which hung on the wall, but the second he had failed to find. It might have been a bluff. In any case, the time was creeping on, and the saint could not afford to carry his feigned languor too far. He would have to chance the second watcher. He began a second circuit, deliberately passing in front of Biddle, and the millionaire looked up casually at him.
"Don't think I'm hurrying you," said Biddle, "but it's getting late, and you might have a rather tiring day tomorrow."
"Thanks," murmured Simon. "It takes a lot to tire me, but I've decided to spend the night with you at any rate. You might tell the big stiff with the damaged proboscis to fill the hot water bottle and lay out some nightshirts." Biddle nodded.
"I can only commend your discretion," he remarked, "as sincerely as I appreciate your simple tastes."
"Not at all," murmured the saint, no less suave. "Would it be troubling you too much to ask for the loan of a pair of bed socks?" The saint was now behind Biddle again. He was standing a bare couple of feet from the millionaire's head, one hand resting lightly on the back of a small chair. The other hand was holding a bronze statuette up to the light, and the whole pose was so perfectly done that its hidden menace could not have struck the watchers outside until it was too late. Biddle was a fraction quicker on the uptake. The saint caught Patricia's eye and made an almost imperceptible motion towards the window, and at that moment the millionaire's nerve faltered for a split second, and he began to turn his head. In that instant, the saint sogged the statuette into the back of Biddle's skull, without any great force, but very scientifically. In another lightning movement, he had jerked up the chair and flung it crashing into the light, and blackness fell on the room with a totally blinding density. The saint sprang towards the window. "Pat!" he breathed urgently. He touched her groping hand and got the French window open in a trice. There was a hoarse shouting in the garden and in the corridor, and suddenly the door burst open and a shaft of light fell across the room, revealing the limp form of Biddle sprawled in the armchair. A couple of burly figures blocked the doorway, but Patricia and Simon were out of the beam thrown by the corridor lights. Before she realized what was happening, the girl felt herself snatched up in a pair of steely arms. Within a bare 5 seconds of the blow that removed Sir John Biddle from the troubles of that evening, the saint was through the window and racing across the lawn, carrying Patricia home as he might have carried a child. The complete maneuver was carried through with so faultless a technique that Simon Templar, for all his burden, passed right between the two men who were waiting outside the French window, and the ambush was turned into a cursing pursuit. As soon as that danger was past, Simon paused for a moment to set the girl down again, and then, still keeping hold of her hand, he ran her towards the obscurity of a clump of bushes at the end of the lawn. They had a flying start, and they reached the shrubbery with a lead of 6 yards. Without hesitation, the saint plunged into the jungle, finding by instinct the easiest path between the bushes, doubling and dodging like a wild animal, and dragging Patricia after him with no regard for the twigs and branches that ripped their clothes to shreds and grazed blood from the exposed skin. Presently he stopped dead, and she stood close beside him, struggling to control her breathing while he listened for the sounds of pursuit. They could hear men ploughing clumsily through the shrubbery, calling to one another, crashing uncertainly about. Then, as the hunters realized that their quarry was running no longer, the noise died down, and was succeeded by a tense and straining hush. Patricia heard Simon whispering in her ear. "We're right by the wall. I'm going to get you over. Go home, and don't say anything to your aunt. If I don't turn up in an hour, tell Dr. Khan. Get me? Don't, whatever you do, start raising hell in less than an hour." "But aren't you coming?" Her lips were right against his ear, so that she could feel his head move negatively, though she could not see it. "Nope, I haven't quite had my money's worth yet. Come along." She felt him move her so that she could touch the wall. Then he had stooped and was guiding her foot onto his bent knee. As he raised her other foot to his shoulder while she steadied herself against the wall, a twig snapped under his heel, and the hunt was up again. "Quick!" he urged. He straightened up with her standing on his shoulders. "Mind the glass on top. My coat's up there. Found it? Good. Over you go. Have some beer waiting for me. I'll need it." "I hate leaving you." She could just see a tiny flashing blur of white as he moved a little away from the wall, for she was now nearly over, and she recognized it for his familiar smile. "Tell me some time when I can make an adequate reply," he said. "Tinkety-tonk!" Then she was gone. He drew himself up and almost thrust her down into the road outside. The pursuers were very near, and the saint broke off along the wall with a cheery "Tally-ho!" so that there should be no mistake as to his whereabouts. His job at the moment was to divert the attention of the hunt until the girl had reached safety. He also had a vague idea of taking a look at some of the other rooms of the house. It was only a vague idea, for the saint was the most blithely irresponsible man in the world, and steadfastly refused to burden himself with a cut-and-dried program. Again he distanced the pursuit, working away from the wall to minimize the risk of being cornered, and trying to make enough noise to persuade the enemy that they were still chasing two people. Once pausing in silence to relocate the trackers, he heard a scuffle not far away, which shortly terminated in an outburst of profanity and mutual recrimination, and the saint chuckled. In being saved the trouble of distinguishing friend from foe, he had an incalculable advantage over the others, although it made him wonder how long it would be before the search became more systematic and electric torches were brought into service. Or would they decide to wait until daylight? The saint began to appreciate the numerous advantages attached to a garden wall which so effectively shut out the peering of the stray passer-by. Simon Templar, however, declined to let these portents oppress his gay recklessness. There seemed to be some reorganization going on among the ungodly, following the unfortunate case of mistaken identity, and it occurred to the saint that the fun was losing the boisterous wholeheartedness which had ennobled its early exuberance. No sooner had this chastening thought struck him than he set out to restore the former state of affairs. Creeping along towards the main gate, where he expected to find a guard posted, he almost fell over a man crouching by a tree. Templar had the sentinel by the throat before he could cry out. Then, releasing the grip of one hand, he firmly but unmistakably tweaked the man's nose. Before the sentinel had recovered from the surprise, the saint had thrown him into a thorny bush and was sprinting for the cover on the other side of the drive. He had scarcely gained the gloom of another clump of bushes before the man's bellow of rage drifted like music to his ears. The cry was taken up from 4 different points, and the saint chuckled. A moment later, he was frozen into immobility by the sound of a voice from the house rising above the clamour.
"Stop shouting, you blasted fools! Come here!"
"Tush," murmured the saint. "I can't have dotted you a very stiff one, honey, but it certainly hasn't improved your temper." He waited, listening, but he could make nothing of the mutter of voices. Then came the muffled sounds of someone running across the lawn, followed by the dull thud of a wooden bar being thrown back, then a clinking of metal. Suddenly there was a snuffling whine, which sang again into a more persistent snuffing. The whine was taken up in 3 other different keys. Abruptly, the fierce, deep-throated baying of a great hound rent the night air. Then there was only a hoarse whimpering. "Damn their eyes," said Templar softly. "This is where item 1 saint slides off in the direction of his evening bread and milk." Even then, he was fumbling for the bolts which held the heavy main gates. He had one back, and was wrestling with the other, when a dog whimpered eagerly only a few yards away. The saint tore desperately at the metal, thanking God for the darkness of the night, and the bolt shot back. At the same instant, there was a thunderous knocking on the door, and a vociferous barking replaced the whining of bloodhounds temporarily distracted from the scent. "To be continued in our next, I think," grinned the saint. He pulled back the heavy door. "So glad you've come, brothers," remarked the saint in loud and hospitable accents. "We're hunting a real live burglar. Care to lend the odd paw?"
"Quietly,"
advised the voice. A blinding beam of light flashed from the hand of the man who had stepped first through the opening. It stabbed the saint's eyes, dazzling him for a moment. Then, into the ray of it, came a hand which held a small automatic pistol, with a curious cylindrical gadget screwed to the muzzle. The saint knew the gadget for a silencer, and there was no doubt whatever about the accuracy of the aim.
"Quietly, Mr. Templar,"
repeated the crooning voice. "Dear me," said the saint, who never swore when he was seriously annoyed, and put up his hands. Well, I have to say that this book is introducing me to all kinds of slang that I'd never heard before. And also things I've never narrated before and never thought I would narrate, like tinkety tonk. I'm assuming that's kind of like making a clock noise, like hurry up, like we don't have much time. Anyway, I got a kick out of that. Hope you guys are enjoying this book. It is definitely a different flavor from a lot of the stuff we've done before. So next time we'll have to do something super dark and serious or something like that, because this one is a lot of fun though. I'm having a lot of fun doing the voices and stuff. Hope you guys are enjoying it. If you are, I'd love to hear from you. Please get in touch. And thank you to our patrons. Please note that if you are a patron, you are getting these chapters like so much earlier than everybody else. Often at a week at a time, you're getting an early peek at the next chapter as it comes up. And there's going to be some other great perks coming along the lines. My plan actually is potentially to do an entire book that's just for patrons. So you won't even be able to get it. Maybe the first chapter, maybe like a sample, but the full thing is going to be behind the Patreon wall, which I generally don't like doing that, but I think this is just a special treat for my amazing patrons who help support the show. Everything else on the podcast, all the other books we've done are going to stay free as always, but I do want to be able to put something out there just as a huge thank you to the patrons, and hopefully as an incentive for more people to sign up as patrons, because the more patrons we got, the more audiobooks I can continue to do for you. I love doing this and I want to do more and more and more, but I need your help. So if you can't sign up as a patron, no worries, totally understand. Like I said, you'll still be getting free episodes here every week, as well as a full free audiobook if you go to the website and request it, and that'll never stop. So all I ask is you just share the podcast. Tell other people about the podcast. That is the best way to help the podcast continue and allow me to be able to continue to bring you these awesome audiobooks. So I hope you're enjoying it, and thank you for your help in supporting the show in any way that you can. Thanks again for listening, guys, and we'll catch you next week.